The Soviet Foxtrot-class submarine B-59 operates at its maximum depth. The vessel is positioned in international waters near the coast of Cuba. Communication with Moscow Central Command is severed. The submarine is running on emergency power. The air recycling equipment is failing. The temperature inside the pressure hull is extremely high. The duty officer reports the internal temperature exceeds 50 degrees Celsius. Captain Valentin Savitsky commands the submarine. He receives continuous reports of personnel status. Sailors collapse from the heat and carbon dioxide buildup. The medical officer requests permission to administer more stimulants. Captain Savitsky denies the request. He orders the crew to maintain absolute silence and conserve oxygen. The submarine is being tracked. A group of 11 U.S. Navy destroyers circles the patrol area above. The constant tracking by active sonar pings against the hull. The sonar signals are loud and relentless inside the submarine. Captain Savitsky confers with the political officer Ivan Maslenikov. Maslenikov expresses concern regarding the communication blackout. Maslenikov requests authorization to attempt a brief antenna rise to receive Moscow signals. Savitsky denies the request. Savitsky states that raising the antenna will immediately expose their position to the destroyers above. The U.S. destroyers begin a coordinated action. They change formation directly above the B-59. The captain orders the boat to proceed deeper. The pressure gauge needle moves past the safety limits. A sonar technician reports a change in the acoustic signature. The U.S. destroyers are deploying charges. The technician reports the signature matches that of practice depth charges. The first charge explodes in the water near the hull. The explosion creates a shock wave that slams against the B-59. Lights flicker in the control room. Equipment panels rattle violently. The practice charge is loud and close. The shock wave is severe. Captain Savitsky orders full speed. He attempts to evade the attack pattern. The destroyers continue to circle and drop the charges. The explosions are now frequent. The crew interprets the explosions as a real attack on Soviet sovereignty. Savitsky reports that the external pressure is too great. The temperature is still rising. The crew is becoming frantic. They are receiving no instruction from Moscow. The constant explosions and the severe heat are affecting decision-making. Savitsky states that the destroyers are attempting to force the B-59 to surface. The sonar technician reports the destroyers have changed the depth setting on the charges. The last detonation was closer to the hull than the previous ones. The shock wave causes a brief power loss in the control room. Captain Savitsky grips the control panel edge. He orders the boat to remain silent and hold depth. He receives a report that 2 more crewmen have lost consciousness due to the heat. He realizes they cannot sustain this evasion for much longer. The technician reports 3 destroyers are now directly overhead. Savitsky hears the sound of more charges dropping into the water. The next explosion is inevitable. Savitsky orders immediate action. The submarine hull groans under the external pressure. Another practice depth charge explodes directly overhead. The lights fail completely for several seconds. Emergency lighting flickers on in the control room. Captain Valentin Savitsky shouts the command. He orders the crew to report damage. The reports confirm minor hull leaks and non-critical equipment failure. The crew is exhausted and disoriented by the noise. Savitsky confers with the political officer Ivan Maslenikov. Maslenikov says the constant explosions are clearly hostile action. Maslenikov states that the destroyers are attempting to sink the submarine. Maslenikov says the practice charges are only a preamble to a full-scale attack. Savitsky looks at the depth gauge. He knows the boat cannot withstand prolonged attack at this depth. He has no communication with Soviet Central Command. He receives no guidance. He believes war has started on the surface. Savitsky turns to the weapons officer. He gives the order, arm the special weapon. The special weapon is the T-5 nuclear-tipped torpedo carried by the B-59. The special weapon is intended for use only as a last resort against an invasion fleet. The weapons officer acknowledges the order. He moves to the weapons console. The other junior officers look at each other. They understand the severity of the order. Vasily Arkhipov, the flotilla commander, is aboard the B-59 as second in command despite his lower rank. He is required to approve the use of the nuclear torpedo. Arkhipov asks Savitsky to confirm the order. Arkhipov asks if the captain believes that war has started globally. Savitsky says the hostile action by the 11 destroyers is direct proof of war. Savitsky says they are being attacked and cannot defend themselves with conventional weapons. Savitsky says they must retaliate to survive. Maslenikov supports the captain. Maslenikov says the American destroyers must be neutralized immediately. Maslenikov orders the weapons officer to proceed with the arming procedure without delay. The weapons officer begins the sequence to prepare the nuclear torpedo. The procedure requires multiple checks and clearances. Arkhipov watches the weapons officer. He sees the panic in the control room. The crew is operating under extreme duress from the heat and the explosions. Arkhipov knows the launch of the nuclear torpedo will guarantee a full-scale nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Arkhipov orders the weapons officer to halt the procedure. The weapons officer freezes, awaiting resolution from the senior officers. Savitsky shouts at Arkhipov. Savitsky demands to know why he is countermanding a direct combat order. Savitsky says Arkhipov's delay will lead to the sinking of the B-59. Arkhipov holds his position. The submarine remains silent, deep under the ocean with the nuclear torpedo half-armed. The control room is silent except for the continuous sonar pings from the U.S. destroyers above. The special weapon remains partially armed. Captain Valentin Savitsky faces Vasily Arkhipov. Savitsky repeats the order, arm the torpedo immediately. Savitsky says they have endured over 3 hours of hostile action. Savitsky states that the crew's survival is the priority. Arkhipov argues against the order. Arkhipov says the B-59 is the flagship for the 4-submarine flotilla. Arkhipov says his duty is to the entire flotilla, not just the B-59. Arkhipov reminds Savitsky of the established rule. The use of the nuclear torpedo requires the authorization of the 3 senior officers on board. The political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, interjects. Maslenikov states that the captain's authority is absolute in combat. Maslenikov says the hostile action constitutes a state of war, bypassing standard peacetime protocol. Maslenikov votes to arm and launch the special weapon. Savitsky reiterates his position. Savitsky votes to arm and launch the special weapon. The decision now rests entirely with Arkhipov. Arkhipov must cast the final deciding vote. 2 of the 3 officers have voted to proceed with the nuclear strike. Arkhipov asks Savitsky if there is any evidence of global conflict. Arkhipov asks if any communication has been received confirming the outbreak of war. Savitsky admits the communication is still jammed. Savitsky says the constant depth charging is the only confirmation they need. Arkhipov maintains his doubt. Arkhipov says the depth charges are reported as practice charges by the sonar technician. Arkhipov says that a state of global war must be confirmed by Central Command, not inferred from local tactical engagement. Arkhipov knows that firing the torpedo will begin the full exchange. Savitsky argues that Central Command is either destroyed or unable to communicate due to enemy jamming. Savitsky says they are operating without guidance and must assume the worst-case scenario. Savitsky emphasizes the crew's condition and the rising threat from the destroyers. Arkhipov stands firm. Arkhipov says the use of the nuclear weapon must be the very last action, authorized only with absolute certainty of a full-scale attack. Arkhipov refuses to accept the practice charges as sufficient justification for launching. Arkhipov withholds his vote. Savitsky demands that Arkhipov relinquish his authority as flotilla commander. Arkhipov refuses the demand. The submarine remains locked in a standoff between the captain's immediate tactical decision and the flotilla commander's strategic restraint. The silence in the control room is broken only by the external sonar pinging. Captain Valentin Savitsky argues with Vasily Arkhipov over the interpretation of military doctrine. Savitsky says the doctrine allows for the use of the special weapon in response to a direct attack on the submarine. Savitsky argues that the sustained depth charging is a direct attack. Savitsky says the purpose of the nuclear torpedo is to neutralize a superior enemy force when under duress. Arkhipov counters the argument. Arkhipov says the doctrine must be read in context of the larger global strategy. Arkhipov says the submarine is only authorized to use the special weapon if the highest command authority is incapacitated, and the attack is confirmed as a definitive act of war, not a forced surfacing procedure. Arkhipov reminds Savitsky that the primary mission is intelligence gathering, not initiating strategic warfare. Political officer Maslenikov interrupts. Maslenikov says the crew is in a state of high alarm. Maslenikov says failure to retaliate against the attack will be seen as cowardice and will demoralize the entire flotilla. Maslenikov pushes for the immediate completion of the arming sequence. Arkhipov asks the sonar technician to confirm the designation of the charges. The technician confirms the charges are still designated as training and signaling charges, intended to force the submarine to surface. Savitsky rejects the technical report. Savitsky says the designation is meaningless under combat stress. Savitsky says the Americans are using practice charges to force them up. Then they will sink the submarine with conventional torpedoes. Savitsky says they must fire first. Arkhipov focuses on the procedural requirement. Arkhipov demands that the B-59 attempt to rise to periscope depth for 3 minutes. Arkhipov says they must attempt to raise the antenna to confirm if Moscow is still communicating. Arkhipov says a deliberate, risky attempt at communication is mandatory before launching the nuclear weapon. Savitsky refuses the command. Savitsky says that raising the boat to periscope depth will expose them instantly to the destroyers. Savitsky says the B-59 will be sunk before the antenna can receive any meaningful signal. Savitsky says Arkhipov is placing an abstract procedural rule above the physical safety of the crew. Arkhipov agrees that the maneuver is dangerous. Arkhipov states that the danger of rising to periscope depth is a necessary risk to prevent the certainty of global nuclear war that follows the launch of the special weapon. Arkhipov says he cannot and will not give his approval for the launch without definitive proof of war. Savitsky looks at Maslenikov. Maslenikov agrees with Savitsky. The two officers stare at Arkhipov. Arkhipov stands firm by the principle of external communication. The argument continues in the control room. The external pressure is immense. The air is thick and hot. Captain Valentin Savitsky and political officer Ivan Maslenikov are united against Vasily Arkhipov. Savitsky demands a final vote. Savitsky says the argument must end. He says the continued delay increases the risk of the hull collapsing under the depth charge attacks. Arkhipov agrees to the final vote. He says the vote must be recorded in the logbook immediately. Arkhipov then introduces a new condition. Arkhipov says they must confirm whether the destroyers are reacting to all 4 submarines in the flotilla simultaneously. Arkhipov argues that a full war would target all vessels at once, not just the B-59. Maslenikov dismisses the condition. Maslenikov says they are only responsible for the survival of their own vessel. Maslenikov says they must act on the information they possess. Arkhipov says that the only logical reason for the U.S. destroyers to use only practice charges is that the global war has not yet started. Arkhipov says the destroyers are executing a quarantine procedure, not a declaration of war. Savitsky rejects the analysis. Savitsky says the quarantine is an act of war. Savitsky says the Soviet doctrine demands a firm response to hostile enforcement of a blockade. Arkhipov issues an order to the sonar technician. Arkhipov orders the technician to try to contact any of the other 3 Soviet submarines in the area using the low-frequency acoustic transmission method. The technician reports that the transmission is too risky and can be easily tracked by the destroyers. Arkhipov says the risk is necessary. Arkhipov says they must confirm the status of the other 3 vessels. The technician begins the dangerous acoustic transmission sequence. The sonar technician reports immediate feedback. The destroyers above are increasing their speed and changing direction. The technician says the destroyers have detected the low-frequency transmission. Savitsky yells at Arkhipov. Savitsky says Arkhipov has given away their position. Savitsky orders the crew to prepare for torpedo launch. In response to the confirmed detection, Arkhipov interrupts the launch procedure. Arkhipov orders the captain to accept a compromise. Arkhipov says they will rise to periscope depth once for exactly 60 seconds to confirm the visual environment and the presence of any other friendly or hostile vessels. Arkhipov says if they are attacked while rising, he will give his approval for the nuclear launch. Savitsky looks at Maslenikov. Maslenikov reluctantly agrees to the 60-second delay, recognizing the logic of the extreme condition. Savitsky gives the command. The submarine B-59 begins the dangerous maneuver to rise to periscope depth. Captain Valentin Savitsky gives the necessary ballast and rudder commands. The crew works quickly to implement the ascent. The internal temperature remains extremely high. The air quality continues to degrade. Vasily Arkhipov stands by the periscope well. He prepares for the visual confirmation. He maintains his position that the launch is conditional on a confirmed hostile act during the 60-second window. Savitsky expresses his extreme concern. Savitsky says the American destroyers are perfectly positioned to sink them the moment the periscope breaks the surface. Savitsky says the 60 seconds is a window of vulnerability. Maslenikov expresses his regret regarding the delay. Maslenikov says the crew is exhausted and operating at the limits of their endurance. Maslenikov says they should have launched the torpedo when they had the tactical advantage of depth. Arkhipov acknowledges the risk. Arkhipov states that the submarine must be prepared to fire the nuclear torpedo immediately upon any visual confirmation of an attack, including a torpedo launch or direct gunfire from the destroyers. He orders the weapons officer to complete the final sequence for the nuclear torpedo, but withhold the launch key. The submarine rises slowly. The sonar technician reports the destroyers are approaching the area of ascent. The pinging sound becomes louder and more erratic. The technician reports the sound of torpedo tube doors opening on one of the destroyers. Savitsky shouts, "Weapons officer, prepare to launch. We are under attack." The weapons officer moves to the launch controls. Arkhipov holds his position by the periscope. He orders the weapons officer to hold the final action. The deck angle changes. The boat approaches the surface. The control room tension is absolute. Every man waits for the sound of the enemy torpedo launch. The movement of the submarine is loud. The destroyers can clearly hear the B-59 ascending. The sonar technician reports the sound of the torpedo tube doors closing. The destroyers are not firing. They are waiting for the submarine to fully surface. Savitsky looks at Arkhipov. Savitsky says the Americans are toying with them. Savitsky says they must launch before the destroyers have a chance to react. Arkhipov ignores the captain. Arkhipov orders the periscope raised. He demands visual confirmation before the launch key is turned. The final moment of decision is at hand. The periscope slowly rises through the surface. Vasily Arkhipov immediately engages the optical system. He scans the horizon. The view is clear. He sees the 11 U.S. Navy destroyers circling their position. The ships are clearly visible, arrayed in a tight cordon. He sees the crews on deck watching the submarine. He sees no immediate signs of hostile action or an incoming torpedo wake. Captain Valentin Savitsky demands the visual report. Savitsky asks if the destroyers are preparing to fire. Arkhipov reports the visual confirmation. Arkhipov states that the destroyers are maintaining position. They are not advancing to attack. The crews are standing at attention, observing the B-59. The American destroyers begin signaling the submarine with lights. The signal is urgent. Arkhipov cannot interpret the full message immediately. The signal repeats the word surface. Arkhipov orders the crew to broadcast an immediate short-range signal to the destroyers. The signal reports a technical failure and requests instructions from Central Command. Maslenikov argues that the signal is a sign of weakness. Maslenikov says they must fire the nuclear torpedo now while the destroyers are distracted by the visual confirmation. Maslenikov urges the captain to override Archipov's authority. Savitsky remains silent. He watches Arkhipov. The responsibility for the next moment belongs entirely to the flotilla commander. The B-59 completes the ascent. The boat fully breaks the surface. The hull is exposed to the air. The internal atmosphere begins to equalize with the external air. The intense heat dissipates slightly. A destroyer approaches the B-59. An American officer stands on the bridge wing. The officer uses a bullhorn. The officer issues a direct command to the B-59 crew. The command is a demand for the Soviet vessel to identify itself and await instructions from Washington. Arkhipov recognizes the command is not a declaration of war. It is a quarantine enforcement. Arkhipov issues the final command. Arkhipov orders the weapons officer to disarm the special weapon. The crew executes the disarming sequence. The immediate threat of nuclear launch is over. The submarine sits exposed on the surface, surrounded by the enemy fleet. The Soviet submarine B-59 rests on the surface, exposed to the American destroyers. The nuclear torpedo is disarmed. Captain Valentin Savitsky and political officer Ivan Maslenikov log the immediate events. Vasily Arkhipov enters the formal status of the B-59 into the logbook. He records the 3 votes regarding the use of the special weapon. He records the 2 votes for launch and his own single vote against. He records the decision to rise to the surface instead of firing. The U.S. destroyers maintain their cordon. No shots are fired. The American command begins diplomatic signaling with the B-59. After several tense hours, the B-59 manages to establish brief, intermittent communication with Moscow's Central Command. The signal is weak. Moscow confirms that global war has not been declared. Moscow orders the submarine to immediately return to port. Savitsky looks at Arkhipov. Savitsky acknowledges the final result. Savitsky admits the launch of the nuclear torpedo would have started the war. Maslenikov registers his protest in the log. Maslenikov writes that the use of practice charges constituted an act of war, and that the delay exposed the crew to unnecessary risk. Arkhipov reviews the log. Arkhipov counters Maslenikov's protest. Arkhipov writes that the avoidance of initiating a global nuclear exchange was the highest priority, and the correct adherence to the ultimate principle of Soviet military doctrine. Arkhipov records his final assessment. The action was hostile, but not a confirmed declaration of nuclear war. The submarine turns east and begins the long journey back to the Soviet Union. The American destroyers escort the B-59 out of the quarantine zone. Upon arrival back in the Soviet Union, the B-59 command is questioned. Arkhipov is not rewarded. He receives a formal reprimand for the failure to strictly follow procedure and for exposing the submarine during the communication attempt. His decision is classified. The details are not disclosed to the public. Decades later, the facts are declassified. Historians confirm that the launch of the B-59's nuclear torpedo would have triggered a full U.S. response, leading to a catastrophic global nuclear exchange. The action of a single man, Vasily Arkhipov, overriding his captain and political officer, prevented the event. He upheld the principle of restraint against the pressure of survival. The world was saved by a decision to not use the weapon. The moral choice was made in a crowded, overheated control room and logged by a single line in a Soviet naval document.